I stay here to introduce then the first session. I need to let me just check. By the way, you notice that we have camera people here. Don't worry, only the first session will be... Only the first session will be recorded, so you don't have to worry about the rest of the sessions. Everything is confidential, what's being said here, but not what Lane and Nick are going to do. That's very public, you know that. Okay, yeah, got it. So, the first topic and the discussion will be held here this afternoon. The flip chart is available for you to take notes, to write down your ideas and questions. It's about English or machine translation becoming the new lingua franca. And I couldn't help but, last week I was in Moscow. Taos meets Stars. This was our taxi driver on the left, of course. I'm the one on the right. You recognize that. Tars speaks Bashkir and Russian, but not English. And he drives a taxi in Moscow. And he has an iPad mini mounted on his dashboard. And it was a fantastic experience because he guessed that we were French, and he picked up a French chanson, played it through the internet. And we managed to explain to him that, no, we're from Holland. And then he found some other music very quickly, and it was kind of a lute instrument, which could have been Dutch, I don't know, but from the 17th century or so. And then he gave up and he played something else, the kurai. And that was a beautiful instrument. Don't know if you know, we'll play it later in the break. It's a very special kind of flute that people play in his country, where he comes from, one of the Russian republics. And he plays it in his free time. And he typed in very quickly in Cyrillic script in Russian, and then pressed the Yandex button, and we could read that playing the kurai is very, very difficult. Well, we figured that out, and the music was very loud, and it was beautiful. But I was just wondering, will Tars ever make the effort to learn English, speak English, or will he continue to rely on Yandex? Because we had Yandex in our roundtable meeting in Moscow, presenting the previous day about all of their efforts on machine translation, and believe me, they're investing in their machine translation quite heavily, because they need to compete with Google, and they have a larger market share in Russia than Google. And they, by the way, just announced at our event that they're also going to make their machine translation API commercially available. So there will be more sort of effort going into this. So this is the question really for the next session. Will we, we already do here, but will everyone else? I mean, the majority of the global citizens don't speak English. Will they start to learn English using very advanced sort of tuition tools? Or will linguistic diversity be the new reality? And will there be no new natural language popping up as a lingua franca, but will it be technology, i.e. machine translation technology? That's the question. To answer that question, we invited two fanatic language people. Nicholas Ostler, who probably is a walking encyclopedia of languages in the world, speaks many languages, and we had him before the Taos event. That was a great experience, talking about the last lingua franca. So you know where he stands. He thinks English is the last lingua franca, and technology will come to rescue. And then there's Greene, and some of you have heard him speak maybe at a Localization World Conference. And he thinks that, well, I shouldn't say what you think because you're going to tell us what you think. You'll be the first speaker because we follow the alphabetical order on last name. So, Lane, please come to the front.
Thanks very much, Jaap. I don't have slides today, so I'm just gonna speak to you from my notes. First, I have quite a few kind of throat clearings to get through because I do want to say exactly what I'm going to say and what I'm not. But first, few remarks about my remarks. One is that I almost hate to be in a debate with Nick. I'd hate to lose this. I'd hate to win this one in several ways. One of which is that I'm a great admirer of Nick's. I read his books well before I knew I was going to be involved in this debate. His first great book, Empires of the Word, about the rise and fall of great languages through history. And then the second book, The Last Lingua Franca, that Jaap just mentioned about specifically the history of lingua francas in the world. And thirdly, Nick and I agree that English is probably the last lingua franca. In other words, neither of us thinks that another language will replace English as the future lingua franca of the world. It's rather, Nick thinks that machine translation will come sooner and more robustly, and I think that English has probably a longer and more serious future than Nick does in this regard. So I noticed Nick and I looked at each other when Jaap mentioned a time frame of about the next 10, 15, 20 years. I imagine if that's our time frame, I think Nick's laughing because he knows English is not going to be gone in 10 or 15 or 20 years. It has a lock-in like no lingua franca has ever had in the history of the world, and no natural language will ever have in the future, I think. So if we're talking about a time frame that short, I think we're probably in agreement, even Nick and I, that English is our candidate, is the only candidate for lingua franca of, say, the next 20 years. Second of all, I'd hate to win this debate partly because I think the triumph of English around the world, and I think it not only will stay where it is, but will go on to even greater penetration around the world, much greater. That triumph would actually have many consequences which I would actually personally deplore. One is that we're already seeing English, to a certain extent, impoverishing other languages of literature, of scholarship, of science, and so forth. The fact that English is so important, especially in academic and scientific use around the world, is making it so that people simply don't bother publishing scientific articles in French or German the way they once did. And what those languages are undergoing, or what they could soon undergo, and I think it's already begun, is what linguists call domain loss. They're being used, of course, robustly in the countries where they're from, and people speak them around the house, and people love them and are attached to them, and listen to music and watch films in them. But increasingly, we're seeing that only English has the reach to reach scholars and the audience you want to find all around the world, and so it's only English that is developing the vocabulary and the turns of phrase and the style that is needed for this kind of very high-level writing. And other great languages of science, philosophy, literature, and so forth are losing market share in that regard, and they can actually start to suffer as they do not develop the new words required. Of course, you can always just borrow the words from English, but that's an imperfect solution many times. So we're seeing great languages lose out in their place in the world, and that can actually be a real threat to diversity. I think in a lot of ways it would be better if we had several big languages of scholarship and science. But the fact is, today we have only one, and that is, of course, English. Second of all, I think there's a potential knock-on effect whereby English is not currently threatening tiny endangered languages, but it is doing so indirectly in the sense that most of those languages are found in poor countries, places like Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Brazil, Central Africa, these real hotspots of language diversity around the world. And languages are dying out at a regular rate. Many of you will know the statistic that about half of the world's 6,000 languages are expected to disappear in roughly the next century. Well, to the extent that English is the world's lingua franca, those countries, those middle-income and poor countries that have to devote scarce teaching resources, scarce dollars, and scarce classroom hours, they will inevitably they will feel a pressure to devote those resources to teaching the global language, to teaching English, the language that will help their economy succeed. And to that extent, they will not be able to devote those same teaching dollars and those same teaching hours to keeping these small languages robust and living. So the triumph of English could very well be at the expense of other languages, both the great languages of the world that will go through that domain loss, and even through a knock-on effect, the death of smaller languages. So I think this is quite serious, and in a way, the future that I see as the most likely is not one that I would be happy to see. But the debate question here is really, what is the lingua franca for the next time frame in mind? And you can pick your time frame, and maybe we can get back to that in the discussion. You don't need to be told that English is a greater success than any language ever, but I'll just throw out a few numbers. Just about 6% of the world speaks English as a native language. That's not a huge number. And that is, if you think only 1 in 20 people, you might say, well, really, maybe MT has the time to knock off English from its pedestal. It's spoken by about another 9% of the global population. These are very rough numbers from Ethnologue. Spoken by about another 9% as a second language. So now we're getting to 15% of the world's population that speaks English to some degree. And I don't think we're counting here people who just speak a tiny smattering of it, but people who actually have a conversational ability in English. That means that this is, even with just 15% of the world's population, the most widespread language in the history of the world, bar none. More importantly, being a journalist from The Economist, I'd really focus on the incentives behind learning English. Economics in one lesson is that incentives matter. 30% of the world's GDP today is accounted for by countries whose official language is English. That is an enormous number, and if you consider the second competitor, that's 12% for Chinese. And Nick and I agree, by the way, that Chinese is not a good candidate, not a likely candidate in current circumstances for a world's lingua franca, especially the incredibly difficult writing system which Chinese native speakers spend years and years and years mastering, where they are constantly forgetting the characters of their own writing system and constantly having to refresh those memories. For the foreign learner of Chinese to learn to speak and then also to be able to read and write Chinese is a monumental intellectual task, which I have great respect for those who achieve it. But I think that makes Chinese a very bad candidate for the world's lingua franca. Third place on our GDP scale is Japanese, and just 7% of the world's GDP is accounted for by countries where Japanese is the official language, and that is, of course, just one country, Japan. So not only do we have these numbers, 30, 12, and 7, but we see English as a native language in every region of the world, countries in Africa, countries in East Asia, Australasia, if you take in Australia and New Zealand, of course Europe, North America. We even have a foothold in South America, in Guyana. So we have literally English as an official language in every corner of the world. Of course, English is also an unofficial language of every corner of the world. These numbers that I gave just don't do justice to the level to which English unlocks global conversations. Sticking with the numbers for just one moment, though, I once calculated for a column in which I was sticking up for the learning of foreign languages, not English, but sticking up for learning other languages beside English, that learning German is worth about $150,000 over the course of a career. I took an MIT economist's number of a 3.8% bonus for learning German, that you'll earn roughly 3.8% more in the United States if you learn German as a foreign language. And if you invest that and take some very cautious numbers, you'll end up with about $150,000 more in your pension pot at the end of a career than if you did not learn German. The same economist found slightly lower numbers for French and a little lower still for Spanish. Again, this was for the United States. But the same economist found that the number of the bonus for foreign learners of English was 12%. That's 3.8% for learning German. It's about 1.7% for learning Spanish, and a 12% bonus for learning English. Now, if you took your English language bonus, say, let's create a construct called a little English language account, and you took your English language bonus and you set it in an IRA or a 401k or some other kind of retirement account. If you made just 1% real return every year, just 1%, that turns into about $500,000 in your pension fund at the end of a lifetime. $500,000 more that you will spend and enjoy for learning English. That's a big number. I like to use these numbers with my teenage son to get him to think about learning foreign languages. But I can't even dangle $500,000 in front of him because there is no language more valuable than the one he already knows, which is English. I think that anecdotally we all know that a gathering like this is simply not possible without the English language. There's a lot of you in this room who are not native English speakers, and yet we had a wonderful lively conversation last night with Danes, Dutch, Polish, American, Irish, all represented around the table. That kind of thing can only happen when we have a global lingua franca of conversation. Even stipulating that the work that you guys are doing in this room is nothing short of miraculous and amazing. We all know that for now, machine translation is overwhelmingly suited for translating written documents and not for translating speech, much less for the kind of live, unscripted, unrehearsed, messy, real human speech that is the real stuff of our language every day, day in and day out. So I am a great user of machine translation. I use Google Translate and other options all the time. I use them for my own language learning. Working in Germany, I'm a journalist based in Berlin. Every time I don't know a bit of German technical financial writing, reporting, I look it up in Google Translate and it's right 95% of the time, and really quite excellent. But as soon as I have to plug longer pieces of text into Google Translate, as you all know, we start seeing infelicities, we start seeing a very clunky translation, usually useful, usually accurate enough that I'm better off having used it than not at all. But sometimes, and crucially, the non-speaker of German doesn't know when those times are coming up. Sometimes the translation will be wrong, even disastrously wrong. And if you don't speak the target language, you won't know when a translation software is leading you astray. That's an important point, and I'll come back to it. Now, I think a fairly optimistic case for machine translation is that in about 15 years, I would say, you could set the best machine translation platform in front of me at this podium, and it could hear my voice, transcribe what I'm saying into English text, and translate it into a common language for which there are big training corpora out there already. And that the user of that software, if he didn't understand anything I was saying in English, would be able to get a usable, mostly accurate version of what I'm saying. Now, I think that's optimistic, but I do think it's possible that in about 15 years, we might be able to see something like that happen. But I think it would be at least 25, maybe 30 years at the very least, and quite possibly a lot longer than that, before the conversation that we had over dinner last night, or the conversation we're all looking forward to over the bar tonight, would submit to the same technologies, where with a great deal of background noise, with people interrupting each other constantly, with 2 or 3 people talking at the same table, with the clinking glasses and so on, that software would be able to give anybody anything remotely resembling a useful translation of these conversations that we're going to have. And remember that these conversations are crucial to our friendships, to our relationships, and in this case, and here at this conference, to our business and working lives. And I think that if that were possible in 25 years, it would be nothing short of a miracle. But we've seen something close to miraculous already happen, so this is with no disrespect to the wonderful professionals in this industry making these incredible things happen. But I think we would be lucky to see something merely useful at that level, and in 25 years. That's a rough time frame I'm going to put on that. Now, what else is going to happen in the next 25 years? The extraordinary progress of English, the world's not only last but greatest lingua franca, will continue even faster. The crucial concept here is the concept of network effects. The idea that something is more useful the more other people are doing it. One of the great examples people always like to talk about is social networks. Facebook, if you were the only person on Facebook, it would be the most boring place in the world. In fact, that's something, a quote I had from an article I did about Facebook, where he's one of the chief engineers, the chief engineer of Facebook told me, Facebook without your friends is completely useless. It'd be the most boring site on the internet. But Facebook is so compelling precisely because so many people are on it. Our closest friends and our family, well, we keep in touch with them anyway. The second tier of friends that we keep up with Facebook, and the third tier of people we just occasionally check up on to see how they're doing these days, and so on and so on. But Facebook is so powerful and so compelling, not because of Facebook, but because of the network, because of the people on it. Now, of course, everyone remembers how little time it took Facebook to get rid of MySpace. I would have actually put money on MySpace and lost it if I had bet on the continuation. I bet on those network effects and thought that MySpace had a near lock. It was so big for the brief time when it was on top of the pile. But of course, switching from MySpace to Facebook only takes as long as it takes to create a Facebook account, which is to say probably about 45 seconds. The lock-in of a social network that is called English is a very different affair. To go from learning one language and using it in a professional life to a very different working modus, whether it's learning a second foreign language and using that one instead, or ceasing to use English and using machine translation in one form or another, is a very, very different matter. People who spent years learning their English. They not only have great skill in it, but they take pride in it. There's a psychological lock-in that people achieve when they achieve a skill with great effort. I compare it a little bit to like fraternity hazing. People, when they join an American college fraternity, if you didn't go to an American college, maybe you've seen something like Animal House, where you have to do these horrible things and humiliating things. You have to do 1,000,000 push-ups and run around the campus naked. And the point of all these horrible, embarrassing things is to bind you to the community. Once you've survived these terrible ordeals, you're actually very proud of belonging to this great community. And the community of the world's English speakers is a community of people with pride and passion for the fact that they've mastered this often very difficult language, and therefore have been able to take part in this great worldwide community. There's a great elite of world leaders now who have achieved fluency in English and are very proud of their progress in having made that happen. In the next 25 years, I expect this to happen even faster. In 25 years, to be a little bit morbid, 25 years worth of people, a whole age cohort, a whole generation, will die. And that is the last age cohort in which growing up without English, never mastering English, was really kind of a take it or leave it affair. Sure, it might help you in some jobs, in many jobs it will not. And English was more or less a luxury, but ultimately dispensable. In the next 25 years, we'll see a new generation whose teachers and parents, friends, mentors, and older people will be telling them, English will unlock so many things for you in your career. Now, we talk about STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and math subjects, and we're constantly hearing in the United States that everyone needs more and more STEM. We need more science and technology in schools. Well, that's the conversation we're having in the United States, but frankly, not every American needs to master a STEM subject. But any person, any nationality, anywhere in the world, whether or not they need STEM, if they want to unlock a bigger and brighter and wider career, English is absolutely indispensable for this next 25 years. Again, I'm stipulating that machine translation will not be there yet, so whether you're an actor, a banker, an engineer, a computer scientist, or whatever else you might be, you will open so many doors to yourself by learning English, and this is what the parents are going to be telling their kids in this next generation. The numbers that I gave you at the beginning of this talk are only the beginning. I kind of compare the rise of English to the QWERTY keyboard. I'm sitting here looking at a laptop computer, and it has the famous QWERTY keyboard. And some of you might know the story about the QWERTY, where the keys were actually, the important keys were actually put on some of the weak fingers. If you ever notice, A is on your left pinky finger, the weakest finger of your weaker hand for almost everyone. And that's to keep the keys from sticking. If you could type too quickly back in the old mechanical typewriter days, the keys would stick together and you'd have to unjam them manually. So it was intentionally made a little slow and a little clutchy. Well, I think that's a great analogy for English because English has a lot of great flaws that no one would design into the English language today. Chief among them probably our very, very silly spelling system in which the letters O-U-G-H can be ow, o, off, oo, and so many other sounds. It's absolutely ridiculous. We would not build English this way. But nonetheless, just like almost everybody in the world has a QWERTY keyboard, and I realize that many do not, if they type in another alphabet, or if they type in Germany, you switch the Z and the Y. But despite that, despite those little changes around the edges, the QWERTY keyboard has a lock-in that is very, very hard to undo simply because every one of us in this room has learned the QWERTY keyboard. And every one of us in this room has learned English. And that's a kind of lock-in that takes a very long time to change. In the next 25 years, we'll see English not just being taught to kids in middle and upper schools. School systems around the world, particularly in Europe and those richer countries that can afford to do so, are moving English ever earlier in the curriculum. Places like Scandinavia, they're now beginning English first grade as soon as kids come to school. In Zurich, the biggest and most important city in Switzerland, a German-speaking city, English is now being taught before French, the second biggest and official language of Switzerland, to the great regret of the French-speaking Swiss. But nonetheless, the Canton of Zurich has decided as a practical matter that English is more important than French is. So we see countries moving that earlier and earlier in the curriculum. We see parents and schools surrounding kids with English at an earlier and earlier age. Why is that? Not just because they need to learn to speak English, need to be able to learn to understand it and do basic functions in it, But they know as a practical matter that the earlier and the greater exposure to a foreign language when you're learning it, the more you'll learn a native-like accent, the more you'll learn a comfort and a fluidity in the language that allows you not just to get through a very basic negotiation with a cab driver, but to be able to make a joke, to be able to have that conversation in the bar with a work contact, to be able to go on a date with someone, to be able to fall in love. The reason I mention this is because we can see machine translation making these incredible strides all around the world, and I can see a day where if I sat down looking at a piece of a German newspaper article and I just didn't feel like revving my brain up that extra to read the article, that someday I'll be able to plug it in through an excellent machine translation system and trust that the result will not only give me accurate English, but something that I can read that's fluent in a decent English style that can make me dispense with even the bother of reading that article in German. But what's happening with English at the same time? More and more people are feeling English as a language not just that they use, but as a language they own. As English is taught earlier and earlier in schools, as more and more people are making friends and traveling, telling jokes, telling stories, telling lies, making deals in English, it becomes everybody's language, the world's language. We're slipping the bonds of English's association with the United Kingdom or with the United States, with Ireland. I see the Battle of Clontarf is on this kind of cheesy relief behind me, but it shows the old days of how a language is spread. You saw one tribe conquer another tribe and therefore spread its language that way. And so the victors, by and large, got to impose their language on the vanquished. Well, that's no longer happening. People are clamoring for English. They're dying to learn it, and learn it earlier and learn it better because it opens up so much to them. They come to English with a sense of gratitude. If you come from a small country, Denmark or the Netherlands, you speak a language with a great history and a great pride. But you also, as soon as you open that door with English, have access to 1 billion speakers, not 5 million or 15 million, but 1 billion. The world's great literature, science, and so forth, all written in English. Not all, but so much of it, that it opens up so many new vistas that it's simply indispensable for quite a long time. My time is running out, so let me finish with a few rhetorical questions that I'd like you to think about before you cast your final vote. My wife is in the audience. It's her birthday, by the way, so happy birthday, Ava. Ava and I met in 2005 in New York, and Ava is Danish, so I didn't speak a word of Danish when I met her, and I am the kind of language fanatic, as Jan described, who, upon meeting a lovely Danish woman, thought, great, new language. I get to learn a tiny, ridiculous language that there's no reason to learn. Such is my joy for language learning. I would hate to see English take over to such an extent that it would make learning foreign languages no longer necessary. But fortunately for me, we were able to meet, we were able to talk, we were able to fall in love because Ava spoke perfect English. Now, when you think about all the things I said, with, again, no disrespect to the amazing technology of machine translation today and with excitement for the future, ask yourself, how many years will it be before you would be willing to go on a date mediated only by machine translation? If that date works out and you fall in love, would you be ready to have a marriage mediated only through machine translation? Will you be willing to raise your kids only in machine translation, say that they learn the language of your spouse and not your language? So my hat is off to the brilliant people in this audience who have made machine translation the amazing tool, which I use and which I will continue to use, and I know you all will, in the future. But we're asking what the lingua franca of the future is. With a century's distance, we simply have no idea. But in our working lives, in your working lives, and in your children's working lives, the lingua franca must continue to be English. I simply can't see it going any other way. And if I can ask one last rhetorical question, for those of you who aren't native English speakers, or even those of you who are, ask yourselves, would you be willing to let your kids grow up without learning English? Are you confident enough that machine translation will be good enough, soon enough, that you would bet your own kids on it? I'll leave you with that. Thanks very much.
Just Maradich, is Misha Nicholas Ostler, Chucky as Bath, is Sasna. Ach, Tanari ar Mara, Ni Bulu me Gaelgir. Neil me Gaelgir, and so I will continue in English for the time being. That was extremely persuasive, and it was indeed not only persuasive, but it was heart-wrenching. I don't think anybody is going to resist the call to be part of the English-speaking elite at our time. And indeed, if the future of a lingua franca depended on whether you could fall in love in it and not get divorced, I don't think any language would have much hope as a lingua franca, even in the current situation. However, we're not asking here, what would you like to happen? What would you be happy if happened? And indeed, as Lane has pointed out, emotionally, we're pretty much on the same page, both of us. We both love foreign languages. We perhaps even feel a little bit guilty at not knowing as many as we might have had the effort to do. But what I'm going to be talking about is the results of what I see as language inertia in everybody. And when you project that out across the whole world, in the situation now in which technological change happens, whether we like it or not, very fast, and in the case of Facebook, we might not particularly like it. Nevertheless, I have to accept that revolutions apparently are powered by Facebook now, not just love affairs. So we have to accept that this technology is moving, and human beings, being the human beings they are, will try to get by in the situation they are in. I've been inspired by what I've been studying the last 10 years or so. People have been very kind about the books I've written. Empires of the Word was looking at the last 5,000 years of global history as if the main players were language communities rather than states or individuals. And I found some interesting things about that, but perhaps one of the most interesting things that happened to me was that I started having this long-term view of things. And the fact that something's going to be around for a decade, or indeed a century, doesn't turn out to be a very good guarantee at what I would call long-term survival. So what I'm suggesting is that if you start looking at English with the same eyes you might look at ancient Greek, which was once spoken all the way from Spain across to Pakistan, and that situation lasted for about 2 centuries, or indeed Latin, where the whole of our continent here, plus North Africa and the Middle East, was a possible field for Latin. Nevertheless, ultimately, other things took over. Things are going to move faster this time, I would suggest. And so, but what I wanted to, the conceptual part of what I want to say is to try and get this distinction between mother tongues and lingua francas into your head. So when I learn a language, am I learning it as a mother tongue or as a lingua franca? Because I think that makes a big difference in the future of that language. Mother tongues come to us because we grow up in human families, and we don't really make an effort to do it. We might get slapped around or told we're not doing the right thing by our parents, but linguists seem to suggest that parental influence or conscious parental influence is relatively weak in determining how your learning of a mother tongue goes. But when we've got this mother tongue, we tend to love it. We tend to see it's associated with us. We own it, as Lane was saying, we increasingly are doing with English, but we all do that with our own mother tongue. And we resent it when people say it's not necessary anymore, or that particular friend community is not going to survive. Lingua francas, on the other hand, well, they're obviously used in situations where people don't share a common language. But I think one can think of them more generally, and that's what I do in my book, The Last Lingua Franca, as a language, any language, which is learnt deliberately for a reason, however bad. I mean, I was speaking a little bit of Irish at the beginning of this. I was using Irish there as a lingua franca, strangely enough. It's not my mother tongue, much as I might wish it to be. I look the part. But nevertheless, I learnt Irish because I had strange reasons for wanting to try and do so, and got a certain degree of progress with it. The world does not encourage the learning of Irish as a lingua franca at the moment in the way that it does encourage the learning of English as a lingua franca. And certainly when you have command of a lingua franca, it's quite likely that you like it. You think, this is a great, I'm part of an elite. It's one of the interesting things I found when I was writing the Last Lingua Franca is that the expression English language elite has a different reference on every continent of the world except for North America. It's quite difficult for North Americans to think of knowing English as an elite accomplishment. But of course, as Lane was pointing out, it is, and it's very nice to be in that elite. But as the French Revolution showed, not all elites are appreciated forever. People who aren't in the elite tend to feel excluded, and the history of the world shows that those feelings of exclusion can be expressed, sometimes quite effectively. Right, so we've got mother tongues and we've got lingua francas. Now you say, well, which is English? Which is Russian? Which is Chinese? Which is Walburi? The thing is that the great languages of the world tend to be both these things, to a greater or lesser extent. So Lane started out by giving figures for the native speakers of English. That's the mother tongue users of English. But then there are all these secondary speakers who often have learned the language at school. And so they're sort of marginal between mother tongues and lingua francas. And then there are all these people in China who, as just skip ahead here, our ex-Prime Minister Gordon Brown remarked in 2005 that the number of English speakers in China is likely to exceed the number of English speakers as a first language in the rest of the world. Well, that may be true, but it's not clear that it's particularly going to be influential for the long-term future of English. Those will, of course, be lingua franca speakers. Anyway, so these great languages have both statuses as a mother tongue and as a lingua franca. The problem is that for most of those other great languages, other than English and to some extent French, they are very localized in the world as we have it at the moment. So there isn't a great incentive for people to learn Russian, say, if they are in Paraguay, because they're very unlikely to meet anybody else who has also learned Russian. Although if you are in the periphery of the old Soviet Union, it's actually, from a communication point of view, and even from a business point of view, quite a good option to make sure that your Russian is up to scratch. So all these different languages, Chinese, Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese, you can see there on the map. I'm sure you know where they are, but they're in one place, and they've got a colour which shows that. If you look for the purple ones, however, it's everywhere. It's on every continent. And indeed, it's more present than this map even shows, because there's an awful lot of English spoken in South Asia, which is idealistically awarded to Hindi on this map. So positionally, English is in a very good position, and there's no reason to think, barring a major global-style battle of Clontarf, that any other language is going to seed itself around the world in the way that English was able to do over the last 2.5 centuries. Well, we all know the situation of English. I just picked out a few things here which may be seen ultimately when the history of this era is written as significant. In 2001, the edict went out in China that everybody at school should study English. So we must presume that Gordon Brown is right to an extent, okay? I mean, to the extent that people actually do succeed in learning the languages which are taught to them at their school. In 2004, Mongolia announced that it would be a bilingual nation with English as a second language. That is sort of defying geography, as I say. The one place perhaps where there's not much sign of English in this global picture is Mongolia. That didn't put off the president of Mongolia, who happened to be a Harvard man himself. I suppose they're working on it. In fact, I presume they are, because there was a news item just 2 weeks ago that a Mongolian member of parliament is putting up a bill to defend the Mongolian language within Mongolia, because they're obviously beginning to feel a bit threatened. They don't seem to have been so threatened by Russian, which was already there when English started moving in. So we should watch that space. It's a long way away. The French have seen reason, you might say, and or rather main force majeure, and have always used English since the beginning of their global TV service, France 24. Well, anyway, there are various other statistics here which don't need to be reiterated. David Crystal, a friend of mine, has conveniently put it into a sentence, though, which he continually laments that he actually put on the page. It may be that English in some shape or form will find itself in the service of the world community forever. Well, that's not so difficult to defend in the sense that Latin is still, in some sense, in the service of the global community in some shape or form. But there are these 4 points which I would commend to you and see if you can undo them. One point which tends to be overlooked when people don't think of the distinction between a mother tongue and a lingua franca is that the mother tongue community of English is not growing. That's to say that mother tongue countries are certainly bringing up their children in English, but there's not an addition to these mother tongue countries. They are not growing by merger and acquisition. English is not replacing other mother tongues, as, for example, Latin ultimately replaced Gaulish in the country which came to be known as France. This can happen, okay? So it can happen that languages spread as a lingua franca can replace mother tongues, but it doesn't seem to be happening in the case of English. I thought of one particular case where you might expect to see it happening would be in South Africa, where there's a lot of resistance to Afrikaans, as people know, as seen as the language representative of the old, unacceptable political order. And there are a number of other languages, African languages, Bantu languages, in fact about 10 of them, which are also have official status. They only ended up actually having official status because the Afrikaners insisted that Afrikaans continue to have official status. And so the black Africans on the other side of the table said, well, in that case, we're going to have our mother tongues too, and they're all going to be official languages. But what you find, if you look at the language statistics, is that people are not, although they are using English as the language which, in a sense, holds the country together, they might even be falling in love across the language boundary and using English to do so. Nevertheless, it seems that as a country, the language communities are holding steady, and that mother tongue speakers of Xhosa or Zulu or Venda or whatever are bringing up their children in those languages. So the mother tongues are resisting the siren call of the surrounding lingua franca. The second point is that just looking at population statistics, well, it's no secret that the growth of populations in the world at the moment is much higher in some countries than others. And the English-speaking countries of the world are the ones which are not growing so fast. So in terms of natural growth, the mother tongue English population is gradually being overtaken by the mother tongue speakers of other languages. This conference, and indeed the embodied knowledge which I see in front of me, means that you all realize that electronic text and speech continue to increase in store, and the means to process them, it continues to increase in power. So that whereas the lingua franca English is somehow marking time, the machine translation solution and the other technical solutions which overcome language incompatibilities is increasing by leaps and bounds. And furthermore, those technical fixes are always going to be, because you can just buy them and download them and install them, they are not, granted they will not give you the nice warm feeling that you have having mastered a foreign language, as Lane was pointing out. People aren't going to feel part of an elite as a result of having downloaded something. Nevertheless, that is the way to go. I mean, I love languages, but I certainly know that when I want to find out something that's in a foreign language, if I find there's a machine translation system to deal with it, I will use it because I will get to the information fast that way. So those four things are happening, and the net result, it seems to me, if you put those together, is that the lingua franca solution to the problem that people speak different languages will gradually decline in importance. I'm not saying that we will necessarily rejoice at this. I mean, it's one of the interesting features of our knowledge of human ancient history to discover that when humanity switched from hunting and gathering to agriculture, by and large, the nutritional level at which average people lived went down. There were more people, which meant you could have bigger armies and dominate and take over things, as long as the people perhaps spoke the same language. But the actual quality of life in the early days, at least, under agriculture, was probably lower than it had been in the rough and ready days of hunting and gathering. So things can happen in society even if we're not happy about it, even if we feel we would be happier as members of the elite, perhaps, if it didn't happen. So it's not an argument that this against the future of machine translation, that it will somehow give us a more clunky world. We might be happy, we might be unhappy with this clunky world, but nevertheless there may be forces which mean it happens anyway. So if the lingua franca solution to interlingual communication is weakening, then the language which happens to be in lingua franca at the time, namely English, is likely to go down with it. This is not saying anything about the future of mother tongue English, or indeed people continuing to use English in the way that they went on using Latin for 1,000 years after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. But it is saying that English will have less functions as a lingua franca and will not do what perhaps I think the typical member of the public thinks will happen, is that English will progress from being the world's lingua franca to become the world's mother tongue. I don't think that's going to happen at all. As a result, we should rejoice, perhaps, in living in the era of peak English. But it is peak English. And when you're at the top, there's only one way to go. Thank you very much.
Any questions or any challenges for the points of view here for the debate? Renato.
Thank you both. Fantastic presentations. My question is the hybrid. How about the Blade Runner scenario where there is no more English, it's English, Chinese, Spanish at the same time, and there is technology, and you're talking to machines. I think there's a session about machines and wearables and things like that. What if the scenario, I think the scenario might change completely, and we're talking still based on our current reality. What about the new realities? What about right now we're talking to machines, we're not talking to people all the time.
I think this is one for you, because he seems to be in my faction.
I'm glad you mentioned Blade Runner, because I was going to mention Blade Runner, and the next year, 2015, will be the year in which Back to the Future 2 is set. And if anybody remembers Back to the Future 2, everyone's flying around in flying cars, but nobody's got a smartphone in their pocket and Wikipedia on it. So we're very bad, and I mentioned, and we were talking about this last night, and my wife said, well, that's a Hollywood. Smarter futurologists were not writing Back to the Future 2. Well, smart futurologists were writing books like Stanley Clark's 2001, 2010, and so forth. We're very bad at seeing the future, actually. I mean, past 25 years and our futurology is rubbish. We really, we don't, we extrapolate from current trends, and that's what Nick and I are both doing to a certain extent. And we forget, we don't see some small thing becoming a huge thing, like the speed at which processors and data storage have gotten better has made that smartphone possible, and Nick now thinks it'll make a really excellent MT in your pocket possible as well. I think the future is probably a hybrid. I give you the strong case because we've set this up as a debate. Jaap posed the question of will Tars drop what he's doing and find the time to learn English. Maybe he won't. Maybe a cab driver in a big country where most of his fares will be Russians will not need more than Yandex to get by. And that will be true for a lot of the middle and especially the poor classes of the world. So the lingua franca is almost by definition the language of elites who travel, who trade, who are in the officers in the army, but not necessarily the men, and so forth. And so I really am looking at that top layer, and I think that English has a very, very long run in it for that top layer. But for the great majority of people, maybe not the great majority, for a very large number of people, MT will be good enough. But the forces that make English attractive will keep pushing it down through the socioeconomic classes. The more the top layer speaks it, the more the next layer down will hear it and feel comfortable with it, and their children will speak it better. And the more that layer speaks it better, the next rung's children down will hear more of it and feel more comfortable in it. And so it just exerts a natural diffusion. And it doesn't have to replace mother tongues, just to Nick's key point. It doesn't have to replace people's mother tongues, but the more and more it becomes a language that people speak, albeit as a second language, but they speak it comfortably. They speak it like a language that they own themselves, like everyone in this room does who doesn't speak it as their first language. The more we can see the two happily coexisting. But if they're happily coexisting alongside Russian, Chinese, Spanish, and so forth, then, you know, my side of the debate wins, and the English is still an important lingua franca for a huge and critical slice of the world's population.
Could I just add to that? I think in general we're in danger of agreeing with each other, but I think what Lane is neglecting is the social effects of elites. Elites in general are sooner or later resented. And we can see this happening in a very different context, no doubt, within the European Union over the last week or two, in that parties which for one reason or another think they are standing up for the little man, or the people who are not benefiting from current trends, are standing up and being counted and claiming that they are the ones who represent the future. So we've talked, and nobody doubts the fact that if you want to be a member of the global elite, if you want global culture to be your culture, then there's no two ways about it. You've got to get into English if you live in the 21st century. But you might be a fellow citizen of one of those global elite people who didn't actually like the way things were going, who thought, I don't want to be constantly given American films when I want to watch something which reminds me of my own home life or something like that, or The Neighbours. Why have we in Mongolia got to listen to what they're doing in Fifth Avenue and in Boston when it's really got not the slightest thing to do with us unless we view those people as our masters? So I think there's a political dimension to this which will assert itself, human beings being what they are.
That's interesting, Nick. You saved that key point until this time. I thought you would include that in your presentation. Yeah. Eva, with your birthday.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's interesting you mentioned the political point, because I think perhaps technology in that case might be a good argument for English. I mean, one of the things that I've done is look at how the internet enables the people that you mentioned that could feel oppressed by English, but it actually enables them to communicate. So I can be reading a blog post from a Mongolian blogger, and he wants to reach a sympathetic audience in the rest of the world, maybe fighting against a local regional oppression, and he will be writing in English. I will be talking to, social activists in Latin America or in Africa or in Southeast Asia, and the one language that they all aspire to master is English. And I don't think that the younger generations necessarily see it as an either-or option. I mean, I think all of them, I can't really say us anymore perhaps, but all of them are fiercely proud of their local languages, but they also, I think, this is my impression, see English as the one language that unlocks the world. So precisely because technology, will enable, let's say, an activist somewhere who might not have a lot of formal schooling behind them, but they have some translations options, and then the one language they translate into, it's English. There's really no other point for them to choose any other language. So I think the oppression that you mentioned, yes, I think that English can be seen as the opposite.
Yes, well, I just to follow up on that, it is going to be a complicated situation, because by and large, the people who I was mentioning were voting against the large institutions in the last couple of weeks in Europe are typically older people, all right? It's not the young who are doing the resenting of it. They perhaps falsely, but at least they have the optimism of youth, thinking, no, we're all going to be members of the elite. We don't. It's people who are over the hill and think they haven't made it, and why are we behaving as if everybody has made it? So I think, but then of course society is aging, and by and large, in this same era, the older generation are the ones who are, perhaps only briefly, in a more dominant position. So I don't know about that, but I think that what the balance of the forces will be. But I think one should accept that there are these different forces there.
Yeah.
Mm.
It just reminds me of a brief story about the role, since South Africa came up, about the role of English and Afrikaans in South Africa. Nelson Mandela, a native Xhosa speaker, was actually a great student of English, loved the language, and fought for his many, many decades for the black rule in South Africa in English, right? He might have spoken with his fellow Xhosa speakers in that language, but he had to deal with Zulu speakers and Window speakers and all of the others. There was only one possible vehicle for South African black nationalism, and that was English, and he had no problem with that. He learned from Mahatma Gandhi, whose language was English for the wider world. Gandhi, of course, had spent his time in South Africa. Gandhi and Nehru, by the way, falsely predicted that what they called Hindustani, which we would call Hindi Urdu today, would be the unifying language of India. But no, the unifying languages of both India and South Africa, ironically, given the history of colonization, is English. And it was a tool that the freedom fighters used self-consciously to communicate with the wider world of freedom fighters and to communicate with their co-nationals, but not their fellow first language speakers.
It's true that, surprisingly, the Afrikaners were the linguistic heroes of the apartheid struggle, in that they stood up for the assertion of mother tongues in the South African constitution when it came. It's also the case that Nelson Mandela was possibly unique, but certainly distinctive among the freedom fighters in that he actually believed that they should be learning Afrikaans on the grounds of knowing the enemy. And it's, in a way, I mean, it's a bit strange that Afrikaans has been so taken over by a particular elite who are a relative minority of the people speaking it, because actually the majority of people who speak Afrikaans are coloured people or indeed black people in the country. So, but in any case, I don't, well, South Africa is a very complicated situation, and you've given the example of two non-white lawyers who were extremely good at English and then succeeded in translating that situation into revolutions in their relevant countries. Well, they are representative, it's true, but I do not think they are part of a majority.
No.
Yes, there is some. Andrew, I'll go to you first.
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed the contributions as well. I think it's interesting that, like myself, we have two English native speakers who grew up in a fairly monolingual environment. Talking about this subject, I grew up in a monolingual environment. I now live in a household where we speak 4 languages, where what I notice and what I've noticed in my travels is that in fact, this idea of there being one lingua franca or one language that people use is rather outdated and rather Anglo-centric. What I typically see if you go to India or Africa or South Asia or more or less anywhere outside the areas where there's big monolithic dominant languages, is everyone is massively multilingual. You talk to a taxi driver in Bangalore, he'll say he speaks 8 languages. And he uses those languages for trade. He's not learning them to be fancy or learning them to do anything. It's a very transactional view of language where he'll learn the language enough to talk about the weather and do the deal that he wants to do. But language is just something they learn enough to be able to do what they need to do. And talking about the value of the language, they're measuring how much effort do they put into a language in order to get the value they need from it. The other thing I think is important that gets forgotten in this whole discussion is that people use languages to build communities. So despite the fact that they might happily learn Swahili or English or Chinese or whatever in order to get something done, they're always going to be very keen to maintain their own language and to use that to build their communities. This has been known since Lebov and others studied it in the US, but everywhere in the world people learn their languages to protect themselves from globalization and from becoming, it's like they become little secret codes. And that's something I think that gets lost in this discussion.
If I could jump on that, just because it ties together a couple of points that I think are really important. First of all, not a plug, but I wrote a whole book called You Are What You Speak about just this, which is how attached people are to their language and their form of their language. It makes it very easy to know who's on my team and who's not, and people have a very strong drive to associate with that. So I don't see English replacing other mother tongues much. And so Nick's point 1, I think, was that English is not gaining mother tongue share. But the point you just made is a crucial one, which is that many, perhaps most of the people in the world, and perhaps most of the people of the world in human history, were multilingual. We in the monolingual Anglo countries tend to forget that, but most people can quite comfortably speak 2 languages or more if they grow up with them in society. And my whole thesis is that people will increasingly grow up with their home language, and English will just be in the air. They'll hear it spoken. They'll see it on the television. They'll see it in films. Increasingly, people will be subtitling rather than dubbing. They'll hear it early in school. They'll hear it often. They'll be traveling more. And so that it will become part of everybody's multilingual mix. So that Bangalore cabbie who maybe speaks Urdu and Pashto and Punjabi and whatever else, almost everyone will have English in their mix. An increasing number of the multilinguals of the world will have at least English, and perhaps also several of their regional languages. Sure, they're not mutually exclusive. So English can triumph not necessarily at the expense of other languages. The only way for a lingua franca to triumph and help us all do business together and not destroy diversity is if people are multilingual. And that's why I'm just an apostle for multilingualism and language learning, for Americans and Brits to learn foreign languages, and for those who learn English as a second language to also learn a third language. a regional language or something that's more important to them. I've made this case in my column on The Economist and so forth, because I would hate to see that diversity destroyed. But the naturalness of multilingualism is a case for English, because the more we find people can easily learn two languages, the more families are going to make sure that their kids have English as one of them.
Yes, I'm a little bit uncomfortable listening to the last thing you were saying, Lane, because you seem to be implying effectively that English is going to become one of people's mother tongues. So it's going to be in the mix, you say. That's when the people grow up. And that's pretty similar to saying that actually people are acquiring this language naturally without having a purpose for learning it, or a conscious purpose. But it seems to me that the lesson of what we see globally at the moment is that people who are in the elite do not, and that's to say they speak English, they have learnt English, which wasn't their first, they don't use it in their families.
Right. I don't anticipate that people would use it in their own families, but in wider community. I think it's sort of like Swahili in East Africa, and you would know more about the situation than me. I understand that it's spoken in so many countries, and most of the other languages there are so small that it's just natural that people hear and so speak pretty decent Swahili because they're just hearing it round quite a bit, even though its native mother tongue population is quite small. So I can see the number of second language speakers well outnumbering the first language speakers. But it doesn't have to be the language people use at home. It's just the language that people use in the market when they encounter someone with whom they don't share a language. And as nobody gets tired of saying, we're now in a big global market.
Question here from...
Hi, thank you both. I found both presentations persuasive. What I'd like to ask you is, what would you say is the main difference in what you view versus what your counterpart views? Because it seems to me you agreed on much more than you disagree on.
We want to polarize it a little better so that we can make our votes.
Well, I suppose what I'm trying to do is to get a different framework, a way of looking at the world's languages which takes the long view of history and is not polarized towards the language which we all happen to be speaking at the moment. So I'm trying to see things within a bigger framework and show that many of the forces which we have seen have damaged lingua francas in the past will damage English because they're there. There are some new forms, things which are going on, like language technology beyond writing. Language technology as writing has been with us for a long time, but this new dynamic form of language technology is something new in the mix, and it will only tell against the ordinary surge of come and go of lingua francas, which we've seen in the world's history in the past. So that's my view, is to try and get you to take the long view while conceding most of the immediate points to my opponent, I think.
I would make, I guess, a couple of points that I think push me in my direction and not Nixon. One is that he says rightly that language learning is a relatively resource-intensive enterprise. It's hard, in other words. And it's easier to pick up Google Translate and get just what you need and not worry about the finer points. What I think is changing is that it's getting easier because children will be exposed to so much more English just as a matter of course. They'll hear it more, they'll speak it more, they'll hear it directed at them, they'll be in places where people speak to them in English, or they will hear their parents speak it to other people, so they'll have that live exposure, which is critical. You can't just get it from TV. But they'll also get it from TV, from music, from the internet. I've been told that kids are learning English from Minecraft and World of Warcraft. If anybody's got a 12-year-old boy, you know what these are. If you don't, you will. But there's a fascinating...
The last thing you ever know.
Yeah, there's a fascinating PhD thesis in linguistics to be written about the English of Minecraft. Apparently it's become a massive driver of kids learning the language, just because they want to be able to chat with each other. So... The other thing I pick up on is Nick's a great historian of languages, but I'd be wary of extending the story of Sanskrit or Latin or Greek into the future because the forces have changed, and Nick and I both pointed to computing power as a major disruptor. We just simply can't assume anything is going to happen like it did 3,000 years ago. And then I would say is the other force is just none of those languages, not Greek at its height, not Sanskrit at its greatest extent, none of them were anywhere close to the global reach and the depth down the socioeconomic ladder of English. No one has gotten that far and that deep. So we have no idea whether that lock-in is permanent or that other force, the growth in computing power, will ultimately somehow unseat it.
So you got it a little clearer, pictures. Thank you, Henry, for that question. Last question, I think, Jack.
Hi guys, terrific presentation, Lane and Nick. I love the Blade Runner example. And you know, Lane, you said, hey, we're particularly bad at predicting the future, and these future shock movies are supposed to do that. The most shocking thing to me of Blade Runner is there's a scene where the Harrison Ford character has to make a phone call, and he goes to a payphone because we couldn't figure out that, hey, I might have a phone in my pocket by then, much less the computer. So here's my question. So if you subscribe to that, the most important thing that has happened since Blade Runner, since Back to the Future, where they were looking at a Mr. Fusion to help make the car fly, that they threw banana peels in, was not energy or medicine or whatever as a part of these, but is software. And that, as Mark Andreessen says, that software is eating the world. We're going to talk about the Internet of Things and hardware, but it's ultimately software. That is the driver. And what is all software written in today and likely in the future? It's English. It's spec'd, it's developed, it's commented. If-then statements are literally if and then in English around the world. And as you see organizations like Code.org trying to drive the earlier adoption for both boys and girls in kindergarten, first grade, et cetera, to teach people to code, just recognizing just how critically important software is. My question finally, do you believe that software and the fact that it is written in English and likely will be from now on, and as it's adopted as something that you must know as the important part of the incentives, that's actually going to drive the adoption of English even further?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that I would classify if-then as in a program as sufficient to say that the program is written in English. I mean, they claim to be written in other languages, like Perl or C++ or whatever. And granted that a lot of those languages have been designed by people who are thinking in English and assume that a convenient mnemonic for many of the terms will be English words. That's fair enough. But it was notable that the early explosion of digital technology was promoted by countries such as Japan, which did not have English as a first language. Indeed, I was actually working briefly in the software industry in Japan in the late 70s and early 80s, where they were happily using numeric codes and getting ahead. You know, this was Fujitsu, who were developing machine translation at the very same time. So I don't think it's very significant that the character set which is used for codes is usually some form of Latin. And of course Latin means that it actually goes back to the Romans, not to us. And other than that, I don't see there's any sense in which it is in English. And even if it weren't, there's no... software is the easiest thing to convert automatically into some other code which looks more like another language. So I feel it's a relatively superficial point, let's put it like that.
Let me use that to jump off on a slightly different point, because I agree with a lot of what Nick just said. Computer code is not a natural language and vice versa. And that actually points up a reason why I don't think computer software, even the best software, can ever replace, or at least not anytime soon, a natural conversation between two people in a natural human language, and it's the following. Computers, still the very best of them today, speaking of Blade Runner, speaking of 2001, what we predicted so long ago is that computers would get a lot more human-like, that HAL 9000 and the replicants and so forth would be naturally human-like. The best of these systems today simply cannot pass the Turing test, as we all know. Siri is great for a lot of really closed domain, really specific tasks, but you wouldn't want to go on a date with her. As many times as my 13-year-old boy asked her to do inappropriate things with them, she's programmed with a few stock responses. But she's not a human being. She's not even close. We imagined we'd have gotten there by 2001 when Stanley Clark set HAL 9000, but we're not even close. The very best in the world is nothing close. For software to be able to translate a fluid human conversation on the fly, it would have to understand what both humans understand. To process language, you're not just compiling computer code. You have to share a whole world of assumptions. If I mention a person and then 5 minutes later use he, you have to remember who I'm talking about, and you have to remember all of these other associations that are non-linguistic. So our linguistic knowledge is a code, but it's embedded on so much more information that you just simply can't possibly give a computer. That's why they make mistakes that no human ever would. You know, we all know the famous and apocryphal examples of bad translations, like the computer that supposedly translated the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak into Russian as like the vodka is good but the meat is terrible. As far as I know, not a true story, but it's plausible. It's the kind of thing a computer might do because it doesn't understand what the aphorism is actually about. So our language is embedded in our human knowledge, and you have to give a computer that human knowledge to make it fully able to replace knowing a foreign language. This is why machine translation is so good in a fixed domain when the European Commission, which I know is represented here, or a technological industry can give it all of the most common translations needed for that industry only. So it resolves a lot of the ambiguities. And the other techniques are statistical. You see X is most often translated as Y. So we're getting better. We're screwing that error rate down very slowly to really make it so that we can have that conversation later in the bar. I just think we're way, way, way away, and that's why lingua franca is still going to matter.
Thank you. Dear industry leaders, it sounds like Sophie's choice here, because if Lane wins, everyone will speak English and you're no longer needed. If Nick wins, machine translation will win and you're no longer needed. But you're the industry leaders, so you've already probably decided and you didn't need this debate this morning. I'm going to send you an email a little later with the link to the survey. If you change your mind, if you already voted, you can go back and select the other one. If you haven't voted yet, we ask you to vote. And tomorrow afternoon, we'll know where the future will bring us. English, technology, and we'll have an excellence award for the winner. So stay tuned, vote, enjoy the debates, and thank you very much, Nick. Thank you very much, Lane. Stay with us.
All right.